Now, there seems to be perhaps a disproportionate number of elections happening in the world today. It seems that there's a convergence of democracy from around the world. Of course, with election results recently from South Africa and Mexico, there was a sort of an election in Russia, and the impact of the elections in the United States before the end of the year, the ripples of that will be felt around the world. But New Zealand doesn't have an election this year. However, as a part of the geopolitical system, what happens in different parts of the world affects us here as well. Joining us on the program now, Professor of International Relations at Otago University, Professor Robert Patman. Kia ora. Good morning. Thanks for your time.
Kia ora, Andrew. Thank you.
Is this an anomaly that we have just so much democracy around the world today? This is perhaps an unusual convergence, do you think?
Yes, I think it is quite unusual because I think in quantitative terms, the number of democracies have actually declined in the last decade. But what is interesting is that we have a convergence of a number of important elections being held this year. You mentioned several of them, and the list goes on. We've just had an important election in India as well.
Yeah.
So, and the UK is undergoing one at the moment. So, and that's a country which historically New Zealand has had quite close links with.
And now, even though some countries are having elections, some are more openly democratic than others. I mentioned Russia and India, perhaps an example of, not quite open and free elections in that regard. Let's focus on the UK, though, because this is an unusual one. And it's looking like the inevitability of a heavy defeat for the Conservatives. What's your take on it, Robert?
It certainly looks that way at the moment, Andrew, but both you and I have been around long enough to know that elections always can often defy predictions. And at the moment, I think the election is Mr. Starmer's to lose. He seems to be about, the Labour Party led by Keir Starmer, seem to be about 20 points or thereabouts ahead. All the latest polls show that. But there is some interesting developments. They had Mr. Keir Starmer, Mr. Sunak had the Conservative Prime Minister had their first head-to-head, and it seems that many people thought it was a bit of a draw, but Mr. Sunak also apparently misrepresented Labour's tax policy,
wow,
which seems to have left most neutral observers pretty upset. That it seems to be symptomatic of a government which has problems always being factually correct.
Yeah, no, certainly. But I mean, to be fair, Rishi Sunak, not the most bizarre Conservative leader, not the most bizarre or headline-grabbing Prime Minister that England's had in the last wee while, thinking of Boris Johnson, of course. But
Right.
From the opposite point of view, the Labour candidate, I think anybody who was leader of the Labour Party would probably get in, not necessarily because of who they are, but because of who they're not.
Yes, and I think Mr. Starmer's been playing it very safe. I take your point about Mr. Sunak, Rishi Sunak, because he has come in at the tail end of a 14-year period in government for the Conservatives, and he's got a hard job on his hands trying to justify that this government, which has been in power for so long, is going to do all new things in an exciting, transformationalist way. There's some key issues in this election: cost of living, health. Also, I think the economy generally. The British economy has been in quite steep decline overall since Britain left the EU.
Well, we wait and see in this regard. It could be, I mean, if polls are to be believed, the biggest landslide for Labour since Tony Blair, possibly even bigger than that. But hey, things change in politics. Looking at this, though, from a global perspective, and with all of these chess pieces moving around, what does this mean for New Zealand's role in the world? Of course, our Prime Minister's just visited some Pacific nations, the first time as a leader of New Zealand to be involved with that. We can be a big fish in a smaller pond, but on a bigger scale, again, whether it's focusing in on Asia Pacific or our traditional allies with America and the United States. Wanting to focus in particular, though, about whether or not New Zealand's going to be involved in the Ukraine summits in Switzerland, which is coming up very shortly. Are we going to be involved, and if so, who are we sending? Do you know?
Well, this is a peace summit organised by the Swiss government at the request of Ukraine. It's designed to come up with a lasting and comprehensive solution based on the UN Charter and the rules-based order. China and Russia have made it clear they won't be attending.
Yes.
We're not quite sure, to answer your question directly, Andrew, who will be representing the government, but there's some pretty hard, some pretty significant leaders going. Many heads of state are going. Mr. Biden has said he can't go. He's been criticized by Zelensky for that. But most heads of state in Europe, and which is, of course, deeply affected by the Ukraine invasion or the invasion of Ukraine by Russia, Kamala Harris, the vice president, will be going in the president's place. But this is a potentially important conference.
To be fair, I think Joe Biden had a prior arrangement, a fundraiser with George Clooney or something equally as important in the geopolitical world. Although you've got to ask the question, for New Zealand to be involved in something like this, I mean, we're not able to really provide finance or fighter jets. What type of influence would we be able to provide?
Well,
what difference could we make?
We've provided, since Russia invaded Ukraine, February 2022, we provided more than 100 million in military and humanitarian assistance.
Okay.
And make no mistake about it, this is one of the major strategic challenges that New Zealand faces at the moment. It may be geographically distant from us, Andrew, but it has huge ramifications. We're a small country that trades with more than 100 countries internationally. And to do that successfully and to ensure our prosperity is protected, we need to have international order based on rules, not power. If Mr. Putin succeeds in successfully annexing territory from Ukraine, that is a direct assault on the national interests of this country in a way, actually, which is much more directly strategically relevant to New Zealand. They say something, should we or should we not join AUKUS? Yep. This is a direct challenge on the line.
In terms of the influence that New Zealand could have in this regard, and let's say, for example, again, it's not clear at this point, but let's say Deputy Prime Minister and Foreign Minister Winston Peters attends, I suppose in some ways we are in a unique position that we're not a European nation, although some European heritage, perhaps for some, and we're not necessarily coming in with a US perspective, a complicated relationship, but New Zealand in that unique role that we're not necessarily representing the European community or NATO interest in that regard, although, to be fair, negotiating a changing relationship with NATO, perhaps.
Yes, I think New Zealand does bring something quite distinctive to the table and very relevant to Ukraine, as President Zelensky has pointed out repeatedly. First of all, like Ukraine, we are non-nuclear. We have a non-nuclear vision. Yep. Ukraine gave up its nuclear weapons. And secondly, Ukraine, like New Zealand, is a liberal democracy. We must show solidarity with a liberal democracy which is in the process of an attempted annexation by a neighbour which is authoritarian. So there's a lot at stake for us. And yes, we do have some message, I think, which is different. Unlike the UK, unlike the US, we actually want to see the rules-based order strengthened. We don't believe in the veto. That goes back to the time of the New Zealand Prime Minister, Peter Fraser.
Yep.
And therefore, Mr. Zelensky is looking to New Zealand, amongst others, to really support his campaign after the war to strengthen the rules-based system and constrain the use of the veto, which his country is a victim of.
And now, circling back to where we started this conversation, particularly with some of the chess pieces potentially changing this year, with some changes of government, some changes of leadership for some of the traditional allies for Ukraine, do you know where we're at in terms of our relationship with NATO? I know that Winston Peters, some trips to Europe early in the year. There was some negotiations, the rumor of an announcement later this year in terms of where New Zealand sits as a a partner of NATO? What's
Yes,
the latest on that?
I haven't got anything additional to add to that, other than it's a very productive and close relationship. The reasons that New Zealand gels with NATO is because it's a multilateral security organisation. New Zealand historically, whether led by National or Labour, has been very suspicious of unilateral security initiatives.
Yeah.
We believe as a country that unilateralism often causes more problems than it solves. We believe in a multilateral approach. And therefore, although there's a number of, although NATO has a different stance towards nuclear weapons than New Zealand does,
Yep.
I think there's a lot in common there.
And certainly there was indications early in the year that this would be the sort of thing that Winston Peters was exploring on behalf of New Zealand. I think there would be a pretty strong case to say that he would be keen to be involved with the events in Switzerland unfolding in the next couple of weeks, although not officially announced as yet.
No, I think Mr. Peters and Judith Collins, both two figures which, they have their critics, but they do stand up quite firmly for the principles of democracy. And I think they both recognise what's at stake and have repeatedly said and the Prime Minister as well, they're fully behind. Ukraine's determined to repel this illegal invasion. We just don't know who will be representing New Zealand, but I think it's very important New Zealand makes announcements soon. I know these things are sometimes delayed by ministers' commitments, but existing commitments and juggling things. But I do think it's important to send a message to a country that's invaded that we're fully behind them, and we will be represented at a conference organised to bring them just and lasting peace. If we put ourselves in Ukraine's shoes and part of our country was invaded illegally by another, we'd be looking for that support ourselves.
Certainly, and it would be a missed opportunity for New Zealand not to be represented in that situation. And honestly, I'm not sure a previous dinner engagement with George Clooney is a good enough excuse for the US president. But for New Zealand to not be at that table would possibly even send a clear signal about just how relevant we are on a world stage geopolitically, perhaps.
Yeah, it would send a poor signal. It also would, I think, it would bring a reaction of disappointment from close allies like Australia and Canada, who've both done quite considerably much more than we have in supporting Ukraine. I know they're bigger countries, they're middle powers, but they've still done a lot more. And I think it's important that New Zealand is really realistic about the strategic challenge that Russia's invasion of Ukraine brings. That I have heard some disquieting comments in this country. Oh, it's so far away from us. We live, you spoke about a small pond earlier. We live increasingly globally in a smaller pond.
Yeah.
We've seen the catastrophic impact that the Ukraine war's had on the cost of living, not just in this country, but many other parts of the world. It's important that Mr. Putin's expansionist bid fails, and we've got to play our part in helping bring that outcome.
Robert, certainly appreciate your wisdom and insight. As always, thanks so much for joining us today.
Thanks, Andrew.
Hey, thanks very much for joining us in the Rhema studio. Thanks very much for watching the interview. It's kind of nice to have an audience, actually. And if you did like what you watched, then do give us a like, do give us the thumbs up. And if you'd like to see more interviews like that one, or perhaps even better, subscribe and those interviews will come straight to you. Don't forget to turn on your notifications, and we'll see you in the next one. Cheers.